Harrison Ford stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. Not because he lost his train of thought. Not because a stagehand crossed his line of sight. He stopped the way a man stops when a sound reaches him from somewhere unexpected, and his body responds before his mind has time to decide whether to let it. His head turned slightly toward the small speaker that had been placed on the edge of Jimmy Fallon's desk. His jaw tightened. His hands, which had been resting loosely on his knees in the relaxed posture of a man comfortable in his own skin and bored by the need to prove it, went still. The voice coming from the speaker was a woman's voice, old, warm, speaking, not singing, just talking. The way a person talks when they are not performing for anyone. When the recorder is there, but they have forgotten about it. When the words are just words, and the room is just a room, and the person speaking is simply trying to say something true before time runs out. Jimmy Fallon heard the first sentence of what the voice was saying, and tears were already streaming down his face before the second sentence arrived. He was not trying to compose himself. He was not trying to manage the moment. He had listened to this recording 11 times in the past 3 weeks, and it had undone him every single time. And he had known it would undo him here too. And he had decided that was all right. That some things were larger than professional composure. That some voices deserve to be received with your whole self instead of the managed version of yourself that television usually required. Harrison Ford had not moved. He was still turned toward the speaker. His jaw was still tight. 300 people in the studio were watching the back of his head and the side of his face, and what they saw there was not grief, exactly, and not joy, exactly, but the face of a man moving through confusion into disbelief, into something that was taking a long time to become recognition. Because recognition, when it finally arrived, was going to cost something. 300 people held their breath and waited for it to arrive. It was a Monday evening taping. October 2023. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Harrison Ford was the guest, a living legend at 81 years old, an actor whose career had spanned 6 decades and produced some of the most indelible characters in the history of American cinema, a man who had become, in the long arc of public life, something rarer than famous, genuinely beloved. Not in the way of celebrities who are liked, but in the way of people who have been present at the important moments of other people's lives for so long that their presence itself has become a kind of comfort, a proof that certain things endure. The audience had given him a standing ovation when he walked out. He had received it with the expression he always wears when audiences do that, faintly embarrassed, faintly pleased. The expression of a man who has never entirely believed the fuss was warranted, and has long since stopped saying so out loud because no one believes him. He settled into the guest chair, and the interview had been exactly what the audience hoped it would be. Direct, dry, occasionally funny in the blunt way that Harrison Ford is funny, completely devoid of performance. He answered every question as though the question deserved a real answer. He was, as he had always been in rooms like this, entirely himself. They were 20 minutes into the second segment when Jimmy Fallon said, "Harrison, before we go any further tonight, there is something I need you to hear." He reached under his desk and placed the small speaker on its surface. He looked at Harrison Ford with the careful expression of a man handling something irreplaceable. He said, "Someone sent this to us 6 weeks ago. I have been trying to figure out how to give it to you ever since." He pressed play. The voice that came from the speaker said, "My name is Ruth Elaine Kowalski. I am 84 years old, and I live in Evanston, Illinois, and I have been trying to decide whether to make this recording for 11 years. I have decided to make it now because my doctor tells me I have perhaps 6 months, and I would rather spend those months having done this than not having done it. have something to say to a man I met once. For one afternoon, 53 years ago, and I have never had a way to say it. Until now. Harrison Ford heard the name Ruth Elaine Kowalski, and something crossed his face so fast and so complete that 300 people saw it without being able to name it. His head dropped slightly. His eyes closed for a long moment. Then opened. Then he turned away from the speaker and looked at Jimmy Fallon with an expression that had moved through all 3 stages in the space of 10 seconds: confusion, disbelief, recognition, and had arrived somewhere past all of them. Somewhere that did not have a name on television, because television had never needed a name for it before. The entire studio froze. Jimmy Fallon could not speak. He was already crying. Harrison Ford was not crying. He was doing something harder than crying. He was sitting completely still, with his hands on his knees and his jaw tight, and his eyes clear, receiving the voice from the speaker the way a man receives something he had stopped believing was ever going to arrive. Ruth's voice continued from the small speaker. It was steady. It was unhurried. It was the voice of a woman who had decided what she wanted to say and was going to say all of it. The wrong assumptions moved through the audience. Was this a former colleague? A lost love? Was Harrison Ford, at 81, about to hear something about his own past that would unsettle everything? The questions moved in the dark, unspoken, urgent. Then, a single whispered sentence cut through them all. Not from the speaker, but from Harrison Ford himself. Barely audible, caught perfectly by his lapel microphone. He said, "I looked for her for 30 years. 300 people held their breath." And the voice on the recording kept speaking. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1970. Because Harrison Ford wasn't always Harrison Ford. Indiana Jones. Han Solo. The most bankable movie star of the 20th century. He was, once, just a 30-year-old man in Los Angeles who had been trying to make it as an actor for 8 years and had run out of the particular kind of hope that is renewable and was running now on something harder and less forgiving. The kind of determination that stays after hope goes, that does not feel like optimism, but functions like it anyway. That is less about believing you will succeed, and more about being constitutionally unable to stop trying. In the spring of 1970, Harrison Ford had not yet appeared in a film that anyone had seen. He had small parts on his resume, television work, nothing that had registered. He was 30 years old, and he had a wife and a young son and a carpenter's toolkit he had bought, because carpentry paid reliably and acting paid almost never. And he was the kind of man who was not ashamed of the toolkit, but was also not willing to let it become the definition of his life. He was in Chicago for a week in April 1970, doing carpentry work in a building on the north side of the city. An old apartment complex being renovated. Good work, steady pay. A week away from Los Angeles that he had taken because they needed the money, and because sometimes the distance from the thing you are trying to do is what lets you see it clearly. He was working alone on the 3rd floor of the building on a Wednesday afternoon when he heard a woman in the apartment below him start to cry. Not quietly. The kind of crying that happens when a person has been holding something for a very long time and suddenly cannot hold it anymore. The kind that is not a request for help, but is also not a sound you can hear through a floor and ignore. He put down his tools. He went downstairs. He knocked on the door. Ruth Elaine Kowalski was 31 years old. She taught 4th grade at a public elementary school 4 blocks from the apartment building, and she had lived in the apartment for 6 years, since she and her husband moved in the week after their wedding, and she had been living in it alone for the past 4 months since her husband had died of a heart attack at 34 years old on a Tuesday morning in December, while she was at school teaching long division to 9-year-olds who did not know that the world had just ended. Harrison Ford stood in the doorway and said, "I heard you from upstairs. I'm sorry to bother you. I wanted to make sure you were all right." She was not all right. She told him so. She told him in the direct, exhausted way of a person who has been asked that question by well-meaning people for 4 months and has finally gotten to the point where the social machinery of the answer, the "I'm fine," the "I'm managing," the small, comfortable lie, has simply stopped working. She said, "I am not all right. I don't think I have been all right since December. I don't know when I will be all right again." He said, "Can I come in?" She said yes. They talked for 4 hours, not about grief specifically, though grief was the room they were talking in. About her husband, whose name was Thomas, and who had been a high school history teacher, and who had made her laugh every day for 6 years without exception, not by being a comedian, but by finding the specific absurdity in whatever was directly in front of him and pointing at it until she saw it too. About her students, whom she was back to teaching because there was nothing else to do, because the 4th graders still needed to learn long division and the world still required her presence even when her presence felt like the hardest thing she had ever been asked to give. About what it meant to keep going when the reason you had always kept going was suddenly, simply, gone. Harrison Ford was not a man who talked easily about personal things. He had never been that man, and has never become that man. But he listened in the particular way that certain people listen, fully, without preparing his response while she was still speaking. With the quality of attention that makes a person feel that what they are saying matters not because it is interesting, but because they are the ones saying it. And when she asked him about himself, and she did ask, because she was that kind of woman, because she understood that the way out of grief is sometimes through someone else's ordinary life, he told her the truth. About the carpentry, about the 8 years, about the particular condition of being 30 years old and not yet knowing whether the thing you believe about yourself is real. She said, "I have watched you for the past 3 days working in this building. I don't know anything about acting, but I know what it looks like when a person does something with their whole attention. You do everything with your whole attention. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the thing." He left at 7 in the evening. He shook her hand at the door, formal, slightly awkward, the handshake of a man who did not trust himself to do anything warmer without overstepping. He said he would be in the building for the rest of the week. She said she knew. He said he would check on her. She said she would be fine. He checked on her every evening for the remaining 3 days of the job. Brief visits. 10 minutes, 15. He brought food one evening, a bag of groceries, nothing elaborate, eggs and bread and a container of soup from a deli down the street, and left it inside the door without making a thing of it. On his last evening in Chicago, he knocked, and she opened the door, and he said simply, "I hope the year gets easier." She said, "I hope yours does too." He drove back to Los Angeles on Saturday morning. 3 years later, American Graffiti. 4 years after that, Star Wars. And the life that followed is one of the most extraordinary in the history of American cinema. He thought about Ruth Kowalski many times over the years. In the early seasons of the career, when he was still not entirely certain it was real, he thought about what she had said. "You do everything with your whole attention," and understood that she had been telling him something true about himself that he had not known how to hold until someone else named it. Later, when the career was enormous and the idea of looking for a woman he had known for 1 week in 1970 seemed either sentimental or presumptuous, he looked anyway, twice, through channels available to him by then that had not been available to him before. The trails went quiet both times. He did not know whether she had moved or remarried, or simply could not be found through the means he had available. He kept the week in a particular place in his memory, not prominently, not obsessively, but carefully. The way you keep something that is small and true, and does not need to be looked at constantly to be real. Ruth Elaine Kowalski had remarried in 1975. A good man. A gentleman. A man who had made her laugh most days for 31 years before he too died. In 2006, leaving her in the apartment in Evanston she had moved to after the Chicago years with a garden she loved and a classroom she had returned to. For 3 years before finally retiring, and an unfinished piece of business she had carried for 53 years that she had not known how to resolve until her doctor sat across from her in October 2023 and told her, with the careful honesty of a physician who respects the person in front of him, that she had perhaps 6 months. She had bought the recorder at a pharmacy. She had made the recording in her kitchen one Sunday morning in November, with a cup of tea beside her and the garden visible through the window. She had mailed the tape to the Tonight Show address she found on the internet because she could not find a better address, and because she had seen, once, a segment on the show about ordinary people and the extraordinary things that had happened to them, and she had thought, that is the closest thing I know to the right place for this. Jimmy Fallon's team had received it in a manila envelope with an Evanston postmark and a note in the same handwriting as the recording transcript. Please give this to him if you can. Tell him Ruth says thank you. Tell him the year did get easier. Eventually, tell him I never forgot. Behind the scenes, Jimmy Fallon had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. When the recording had arrived and been transcribed and brought to Jimmy's attention by a producer who had listened to it twice and needed to sit down after the second time, there had been a discussion about how to present it. Graphics, archival footage. A structured segment with Harrison Ford brought in separately and given time to process before the taping. Jimmy had listened to all of it and then said, no. He hears it the way she meant it to be heard, in the room, with people around him. She sent it to us because she wanted it delivered. We deliver it. Harrison Ford had not been told anything before the taping. His team had been told only that the show wanted to honor a moment from his personal history and that the details would be revealed on camera. Harrison Ford had arrived at the studio in the way he always arrived, early, alone, with no particular curiosity about what was planned. The settled indifference of a man who has stopped being surprised by what television wants from him. He had not been unsurprised by this. The recording on the speaker was still playing. Ruth Elaine Kowalski's voice was still steady and unhurried and entirely real. She was describing the week in April 1970. The groceries left inside the door without ceremony. The handshake at the end. The sentence that she had carried for 53 years, because it was the first sentence anyone had said to her after Thomas died that was true instead of kind. She said, he told me he hoped the year would get easier. He did not say it would. He did not say I would be all right. He said he hoped. And I understood from that word, hoped, that he knew it might not get easier, that he was not going to lie to me about that, but that he was on my side anyway. That was the thing no one else had managed to give me in 4 months. Someone who was on my side, without pretending the side, was an easy place to be. Harrison Ford's jaw had not unclenched. His hands were still on his knees. He was not crying. He was doing the harder thing. He was listening, fully, with his whole attention, to the voice of a woman he had spent 30 years trying to find, telling him something that had taken her 53 years to say. The recording reached its final passage. Ruth Elaine Kowalski said, I don't know if this will reach you, I don't know if you will remember me at all. I was 1 week in a long life, and you were 1 afternoon in mine. Except that is not entirely true, because you were also the afternoon that proved to me that people were still worth the trouble, that the world still had that in it. A man who put down his tools and came downstairs and sat in my kitchen for 4 hours and brought me groceries and shook my hand at the door and said he hoped. I want you to know that I have thought about that afternoon a great many times in the 53 years since. I want you to know that the year did get easier. Eventually, I want you to know that I never forgot. The recording ended. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Harrison Ford stood up. He did it the way he does everything, without announcement, without preamble, simply deciding and then doing. He stood up from the guest chair, and he walked to Jimmy Fallon's desk, and he picked up the small speaker with both hands, and he held it for a moment. The way you hold a thing that has traveled a long way to reach you, and you want it to know, somehow, that it has arrived. Then he set it down carefully and turned to face the audience. He did not do this often. It was not a thing Harrison Ford did on television, turned to face the audience directly, without the mediation of the host or the camera, as himself and not as a character. 300 people felt the shift the moment it happened. The room changed. The temperature changed. Something that had been a television program became a room with a man standing in it who had something to say. He said, "Her name is Ruth Elaine Kowalski. She is 84 years old, and she lives in Evanston, Illinois, and she is dying." He paused. He was not crying. His voice was completely level. The voice of a man who has decided that steadiness is the most respectful thing he can offer right now, that falling apart would be for him and not for her. He said, "She spent 1 afternoon with me 53 years ago, and she told me the truth about myself at the exact moment I needed to hear it. And she has been carrying that afternoon for 53 years, waiting for a way to say thank you." He paused again, longer this time. Then he said, "Quietly, I would like to say something back, if that is all right." Jimmy Fallon nodded. He was crying too hard to speak. Questlove had set his sticks down. 300 people had not moved. Harrison Ford turned back toward the desk. He looked at the small speaker. He spoke to it directly, without embarrassment, without performance, in the plain and unadorned way of a man who has decided that the truth does not require decoration. He said, "Ruth, I remember you. I have remembered you for 53 years. I looked for you twice and did not find you, and I am sorry it took this long. I want you to know that what you said to me that afternoon, you do everything with your whole attention. That is the thing. I carried that with me. I carry it still. You were not 1 week in a long life. You were the week I understood that the life was going to be long." He stopped. He pressed his lips together. Then he said, his voice dropping, "I hope the time that remains is good. I hope the garden is still giving you what it should. I hope you know you were not forgotten. Not for a single year of the 53. The studio was silent for a long moment. Then the applause began, and it was the kind of applause that happens when 300 people need to express something that language cannot hold, and sound is all that is left. It rose and filled the studio, and Harrison Ford stood at the desk with his hand on the small speaker and let it rise. And Jimmy Fallon stood behind his desk with tears streaming down his face and did not say a single word. Because there were no words in the English language that were larger than what had just happened in that room. The Tonight Show sent the recording of Harrison Ford's response to Ruth Elaine Kowalski's home in Evanston the following morning, along with a handwritten note from Harrison Ford that his assistant had transcribed from his dictation that same night. after the taping, before he left the building. Ruth Elaine Kowalski watched the segment in her living room in Evanston, in her chair by the window that looked out on the garden. Her daughter was beside her. She watched it once, and then asked to watch it again, and her daughter played it again, and Ruth watched it the second time, with her hands folded in her lap, and her face completely still. The face of a woman receiving something she had sent out into the world without expectation and had not dared to imagine would come back. She passed away in March of 2024, 4 months after the taping, in the early morning, with the garden outside the window still visible in the half-light and her daughter asleep in the chair beside her bed. Harrison Ford was told the same morning. He said nothing to the press. He said nothing publicly. He planted a tree in his garden in Wyoming that spring. He did not say what the tree was for. The people who know him say he does not need to. The small speaker from the Tonight Show desk was given to Ruth's daughter after the taping. She keeps it in the living room in Evanston, on the shelf beside Ruth's photograph, beside the window that looks out on the garden that is still being tended, carefully, by the hands of the people she left behind. Ruth Elaine Kowalski never became famous. She taught 4th grade for 33 years and loved a man who made her laugh and tended a garden, and spent one April afternoon in 1970 telling a stranger the truth about himself at the exact moment the truth was the only thing that could have held him together. She was not wrong about him. She was never wrong about him. She was, in fact, the first person to be completely right. The people who tell us the truth about ourselves before we have earned the right to believe it are not ordinary. They are the reason the extraordinary ever happens at all.